Hello and welcome back to the Haunted Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. If you're enjoying these tales, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're listening from around the world. Now let the lights dim, the curtain rise, and may this story guide you into a deep, haunted sleep. The Sleepwalker's Field. The road to Lornvale is not a road at all, but a weary scar in the earth. An old path so seldom trodden that grass dares to reclaim its edges and roots gnarl through the ruts like crooked veins. No one comes to Lornvale without a reason. No one stumbles upon it by chance. The air itself seems to thicken as one draws near, like the land is exhaling some long-held breath of damp loam and leaf rot, a secret buried too deep to decay entirely. Emeryvale arrived at dusk. The sky was an expanse of bruised lavender, the clouds like smoke-draped wings hanging over the treetops. His boots were heavy with clay, the soles worn thin from too many miles of unspoken purpose. The forest had thinned by then, giving way to open meadows rimmed with fence posts bowed under the weight of years. The wind moved slowly here, rustling only the tall, pale reeds along the ditches, and not once lifting the brim of his hat. He paused at the weather-warped sign just before the hill began its slow descent into the hollow. Lornvale, it read in cracked black paint. The wood soft with rot and gnawed at the edges like a scab long worried by time. The name was familiar, but only in the way old lullabies are, something half-remembered, whispered once in childhood, then never again. He touched the brim of his hat and descended. Lornvale was a village in the loosest sense. A handful of stone cottages crouched among tangled gardens and low walls. Ivy had long since claimed the chimneys, and the windows looked not broken but simply hollow, as though they had never held glass to begin with. A single unpaved lane wound through it, ending at a chapel no larger than a tool shed and far less inviting. Yet smoke curled from two of the chimneys, thin as thread. Signs of life or something close enough to fool the eye. The inn, if it could be called that, stood with its back to a marshy wood, its sign hanging by one rusted chain. It creaked as it swung, not with the wind but of its own accord. The Blight Willow, it read in the same black paint, older and more faded than the village sign. He stepped inside. The air was thick with peat smoke and the faint, sweet must of elderberry. The common room held a single table, crooked on one leg, and a hearth that hadn't seen flame in weeks. A woman stood behind the counter. Her skin was pale as bone under cobweb hair, her eyes sunken and veiled in a clouded gray like frost-bitten ponds. "Evening," Emery said. The woman nodded. Her gaze didn't quite meet his. "I'd like a room, just for a few nights." "You'll take the loft," she said, her voice thin as threadbare linen. "There's no key, no need for one." He handed her coins. She didn't count them. "The lantern's full," she added. "Keep it lit after dark. That's all." He didn't ask why. He only took the iron lantern and climbed the stairs. That night he dreamed of bells. Not ringing, not quite. A dull pealing from beneath the earth, as though the soil itself held a cathedral of rusted iron and empty pews, and something deep below it stirred. The second day brought fog. Not mist, but fog, low and thick, gray as ash, curling along the ground like a living thing. It swallowed sound and softened the angles of the world. The sky above was a colorless dome, Trees became silhouettes. Emery walked slowly, his breath held close to his chest as if afraid to let it loose into the hush. He wandered past the chapel. The door stood ajar, though no one entered or left. Inside, the pews were covered in a fine coat of dust. Not disturbed in weeks. No candles, no altar. Only a wooden effigy at the back, carved from a single block of pale, sickly wood. It resembled no Saint Emery had ever seen. Twisted limbs, a hollow gaze, and something in its expression like a scream that had never ended. He didn't linger. Instead, he found the orchard. It grew at the edge of the village, just past a low stone wall, the trees leafless but still bearing fruit. Pale things like misshapen moons hanging low enough to touch. He didn't. There was something wrong in the way they moved in the still air, a faint pendulum sway, though there was no breeze. A woman stood among them. She wore a gown of homespun wool, dyed the deep, cold green of moss, and her hair was bound in a braid that reached the small of her back. She did not look up as he approached. Her hands moved slowly through the mist, tying strips of linen to the branches. "For the quiet," she said before he spoke. "I'm sorry." She looked at him then. Her eyes were not gray, not like the innkeeper's. They were green, deep, old, a forest under frost. "The linen," she said. "It muffles the breath, keeps them still." "Who?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "They haven't told you yet, have they? I've only just arrived." She stepped closer, and he caught the scent of juniper and grave moss. "Then perhaps you'll sleep through it," she said. "Some do. It's better that way." He watched her until she was gone. That night, the bells returned, louder. He woke in darkness to the creak of floorboards not his own. The lantern glowed faintly, though he hadn't lit it. Shadows drifted along the ceiling like smoke. Something whispered outside his window, a sound like leaves dragged across stone. But when he looked, there was only the fog, dense as milk. On the third morning, the fog had not lifted. He made his way to the edge of the village, where the land dipped into a shallow basin. There, half hidden beneath the roots of a toppled oak, he found the remnants of a foundation. Stones blackened with soot, a fire long ago. He crouched and touched the earth. It was warm. Footsteps behind him made no sound. "You're seeking it," the voice said. He stood, an old man, hunched and narrow as a folded crow, leaned on a crooked staff. His coat was patchwork, stitched from hides not meant for cloth. His eyes held no whites, only glints of pale gold, like coins held under water. "I don't know what I'm seeking," Emery replied. "Doesn't matter. The land does." "What happened here?" The old man shook his head. "You ask as if time is still a straight road." Emery waited. The man knelt beside the stone and whispered something in a tongue Emery did not know. The air grew colder. The mist recoiled an inch. "When the harvest was last taken," the man said, "they buried what could not be burned, but it does not forget. The orchard grows from the same soil. The fruit, a memory, promise, a mouth." Emery's chest tightened. "And the people?" he asked. The old man's eyes darkened. "We remain to remember, nothing more." He walked away without another word, vanishing into the fog like a dream on waking. Emery returned to the inn at dusk. The lantern burned brighter now. The innkeeper watched him from the stairs. "They'll call tonight," she said. "Who?" "Don't answer." That night, the bells were not only in his dreams. They rang just before midnight, a long, low tolling that made the bones in his hands ache. The lantern flickered. Wind or something like it pressed against the eaves. Then a knock, soft, deliberate. He did not answer. Another knock, this time lower. The baseboard creaked. He rose and reached for the lantern. Its flame danced, casting shadows in loops across the walls. A third knock, closer than the door. He turned and saw the shape at the window, tall, thin, its limbs all wrong, like branches too long in the frost. No face, only a blur where the eyes should be. It didn't move, but something moved around it. The air, the dark. He held the lantern high. The light pressed it back, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The shape tilted its head, then melted into the fog beyond the pane. At dawn, Emery did not sleep. He stepped into the orchard. Every tree bore strips of linen now, fluttering without wind. The fruit pulsed softly, like hearts too long separated from flesh. He plucked one. It wept. Fog had become the village's only weather. It was no longer a passing veil but a settled presence, soaked into the stones, clinging to the glassless windows, draping itself over the gables and hedgerows like a burial shroud that had decided not to leave. Emery Vale no longer knew how many days had passed. The sun had not risen in earnest since his arrival. Shadows moved differently here, less cast, more absorbed. There was no proper morning, just a paler version of the same dim gray, and always the bells, somewhere far below, sometimes faint, sometimes close enough to rattle the bones. He hadn't spoken to another soul since the orchard. He avoided the woman in green. He never returned to the chapel. But the fruit, that fruit haunted him. The way it pulsed faintly, how it wept when torn from its bough, how the scent of it lingered in the hollows of his chest like the ghost of something he used to fear in childhood but couldn't now remember. He'd left the fruit on the loft's floor, wrapped in a rag, placed inside a drawer. Still, at night, he heard it, breathing. The third evening, he followed the sound of digging. It came faintly at first, beneath the layers of windless quiet, like hands in the soil. Past the low wall near the orchard, he walked until his boots began to sink into the wet turf of an overgrown path. The grass here curled at the tips like cinders. The trees leaned in strange directions, as though reaching for something they'd forgotten. And then he saw her, the girl, no older than 10, with hair the color of birch bark and eyes black as coal. She was kneeling in the earth, digging with her bare hands. A small mound of upturned roots formed beside her. He approached slowly. "You'll wake them," she said, not looking up. "Who?" "The ones underneath." She dug another clump of dirt and set it aside. Her nails were caked black. "They're not bad," she added after a while. "Just lonely." Emery knelt beside her. "What are you doing?" "Looking." "For what?" "A name." He hesitated. "Yours?" "No, theirs." She pointed to the hole. Inside, not more than a foot down, was a piece of stone. He brushed away the dirt and saw a worn carving. Letters almost gone. MRH and a sigil beneath it, circular and etched with 7 lines radiating outward, each tipped with a tiny thorn. "What is that?" he asked. She shrugged. They all have one. Who? But she didn't answer. She rose, brushed her hands on her skirt, and walked into the fog. He stared after her for a long time. The stone was warm beneath his palm. Later, at the inn, the fruit was gone. He had locked the drawer. No sign of forced entry, no open window, no footprints. But the rag was there, damp and crumpled, like something had crawled out of it. He lit the lantern. The light burned higher than before. He opened the shutters. In the orchard, every tree was bare. He confronted the innkeeper that night. "You knew," he said. She looked past him, toward the dark outside. Her face held something beyond weariness. An ancient grief stretched thin and tight like parchment. "We don't speak of the harvest," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because it remembers us when we do." "Who are they?" A long silence. Then, "They were called down," she said. "Once, long ago, the earth was dry, and the wells were empty, and the children were sick. So we made the prayer, with blood, with silence, and the sigils, to mark the mouths, where they first listened." Emery's throat tightened. "And the fruit, offerings, warnings, both." He sat in the dim glow of the lantern. "They took something," he said. She nodded. "They always do." The next day he left the village proper and wandered north, toward the hills. The fog there was thinner, and the trees sparser, their bark pale and mottled like bone. Eventually he came upon a stone circle, barely rising from the moss. 13 standing stones, some cracked, others barely more than stumps. At the center, a pool, a perfect circle of still water. A man sat by the edge. He wore no shoes. His coat was lined with crow feathers, and his beard was braided with small bones. "They're awake," he said without turning. "You feel it too?" Emery asked. "I hear them." The man tapped his temple. "Here. What are they?" The man plucked a stone from the water. It was smooth, black, the shape of a tooth. "They were not born," he said. "They were grown." "By who?" The man smiled, teeth too sharp, too even. "You already know." That night, Emery found scratches on the inside of his window. Not outside, inside. He traced them with his fingers. For parallel lines, curved at the ends, as though made by a child's hand. Beneath them, a small, dark smudge. He sniffed it. Copper. The lantern sputtered. Then a sound. Soft. A lullaby. From beneath the floor. He knelt, pressed his ear to the boards. A voice. "Hi. Fragile. Sleep now, sleep. In hollow deep. The roots will hold. The soil will keep." He stood quickly and backed away. Then the boards creaked inward, just slightly, as though something below had exhaled. The next morning he returned to the chapel. Inside, the effigy had changed. Its limbs were longer now, its mouth wider. What had once been wooden had taken on a texture almost pulpy, damp. The walls wept, not water, sap, dark red, and at its feet a fruit, fresh. He did not touch it. Instead he ran. But the village was not where he had left it. The sky hung low over Dorwick Hollow, a pressing blanket of pewter and silence. Clouds had formed strange patterns in recent days, circular spirals and long, motionless streaks that seemed to watch rather than drift. The villagers said little of it. Conversation had grown scarce, exchanged only in whispers between closed shutters and crooked fences. In the hush, it felt as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The field behind Wren's cottage remained untouched since that night. No birds landed there. No insects hummed. It had become a perfect circle of stillness, a quiet so intense that even sound seemed to recoil from it. Wren watched it often from her attic window, wondering whether silence could rot like fruit left too long in the sun. She'd begun recording the sounds inside her home just to make sure her ears hadn't forgotten the shape of noise. In those tapes, a pattern began to emerge. At exactly 2:11 a.m., a soft scraping sound would echo through the floorboards. Like fingernails across old stone, the same sound, the same rhythm every night. She measured it, 47 seconds long. Then, nothing. Absolute silence. Father Murig had stopped attending the church. The bells no longer rang on Sundays. Ivy grew thick over the doors, and someone, Wren didn't know who, had scrawled a symbol in ash across the wooden cross. A circle split down the middle, a single vertical line trailing downward like a root. She had seen it elsewhere too, etched into a tree near the well, on the base of the statue at the crossroads, once even burned into the hay in a nearby barn. It was Hessel Harper who finally spoke of it. An old man with clouded eyes and a permanent stoop. He had lived in the hollow longer than anyone. Wren found him one dusk sitting on his porch with a rusted lantern in his lap, whispering to the air. When she asked about the symbol, he went still. "It's not a mark," he said finally. "It's a gate. Not for us to open, not for us to close. But it swings, girl. It swings when the quiet deepens." Wren asked him what that meant, but he only stared into the lantern's pale flame, his lips moving as if still speaking to someone she could not see. Later that night, she dreamed of fields, endless and bone-white beneath a sunless sky. The crops were human, pale figures sewn into the soil by their hair, mouths open in silent screams. Lanterns floated between the rows, their green light pulsing like heartbeats. A figure moved among them, tall, faceless, robed in twisting shadow, dragging something behind it, a sack that writhed with whispers. She woke to find her feet dusted in soil. Not mud. Soil. Rich, dark, and smelling faintly of blood. After that, Wren began marking the days with chalk. Not on a calendar, there were no longer any numbers that mattered, but in symbols. A small triangle for days when the wind moved, a square for when she could hear birds, and a circle, always a circle, for the nights the scraping returned. The circles began to multiply. Villagers vanished, not all at once, one by one. Mrs. Kalter, who baked pies for the harvest festival. Her front door hung open for days, the scent of cinnamon curdling in the stale air. Then little Thomas Grigg, last seen chasing moths near the river. Even the mayor, whose voice had once filled the hollow with authority, now a silence in the shape of a man. The town seemed to fold in on itself, street by street, breath by breath. Mail was no longer delivered. Lights were no longer lit. The only place still open was the apothecary, and even there, the windows had turned an opaque yellow, as though light itself had become afraid to pass through. Wren stopped leaving her house after sundown. The third week brought the fog. It rolled in like something summoned, not a weather event, but a procession. Slow, deliberate. It filled every space it touched, clinging to doorways and wrapping trees in gauze. And within it, the lanterns returned. They did not burn with fire. Their glow was too slow, too internal, as though lit by memory rather than flame. They floated soundlessly, always just at the edge of vision. When Wren stared too long, they blinked out like dying stars. Then came the children's voices. They whispered just beneath hearing, on the very edge of recognition. Not words, not quite, but cadences. Rhythms of nursery rhymes long forgotten. Wren recorded them, played them back. And every time, something new had been added. Another voice, a clearer phrase, a question. Do you remember? She stopped listening after the sixth night. She wasn't sure if she was forgetting or remembering too much. One night, in the hour of the scraping, she stepped outside with her lantern. The cold had grown sharp, cutting through her sleeves like glass. The fog was dense, but she moved forward, each step a prayer spoken without sound. At the edge of the field, she stopped. The ground had cracked open, the circle of silence now a ring of darkened earth. And in the center, something pulsed. Not visibly, but in her chest. In her bones. The lanterns gathered overhead. And from the soil, a voice rose, not from a mouth, but from the roots, the stone, the hollow air. You have heard us long enough. Now you will listen. The field opened wider, and Wren stepped forward. The path to old Ludier's Hollow was no longer marked on any local maps. The road, once well traveled by cart and foot, had been reclaimed by bramble and rot. All that remained were occasional depressions in the undergrowth, scattered boards sunken into loam, and the hollow hush of land that remembered too much. Elias had not spoken since they left the edge of the orchard. His lantern barely held a glow, a wisp of sickle-shaped light that flickered in protest each time the wind curled against the trees. Honora followed behind, her breath slow, her mind suspended in a waking dream. The night wrapped around them like damp wool, smothering their steps, muting the world. They walked not by sight, but by feeling. Something in the bones of the land called them forward. It was not invitation, nor command, more a suggestion carried on the weight of memory. A rhythm beneath the silence. A pulse. As if the land, deep beneath the topsoil and the roots, still drew breath. It was near midnight when the fog returned. It came slowly, as though unfolding from inside the trees, not descending from above, but rising from the soil itself. Thick and pale, almost green in the moonless dark. The lantern's glow caught within it, swallowed and refracted, making it seem as though dozens of other lights now floated just beyond reach. Honora stopped. Ahead, the fog bent strangely around a copse of black pines, their trunks ashen, bark hanging in shreds like worn cloth. Between the trees stood a low stone structure, half collapsed, roofless, its foundation strangled by vines and wormwood. There was something unsettling about its presence, not because of its ruin, but because it appeared so suddenly, as though the fog had cloaked it only until they were meant to see. Elias moved toward it wordlessly. She followed, her fingers brushing the rusted iron of a fallen gate. Beyond it, carved into the lintel stone above the crumbling archway, were words in a tongue she did not know, though the rhythm of them stirred something deep within her, like lullabies sung before language formed. Within the ruin, beneath a scatter of broken beams, was a circular stone well. It had no rope, no bucket. Just a yawning mouth, the stones around it slick with moss. As they neared, the fog recoiled, retreating back into the trees, revealing what lay within. The water inside was unnaturally still. It didn't glisten, didn't reflect. It looked painted, matte, like a hole in the world. Elias knelt. His voice was barely more than a breath. They say if you look long enough, you see who's waiting for you. Honora hesitated, then leaned in. At first, nothing. Just black. Then movement. A ripple. Her own face returned to her. No, not hers. Not exactly. Her hair was darker, her eyes wide and wild, her mouth open in some silent plea. Behind her image was a forest that burned green and dozens of lanterns suspended in the smoke. She staggered back. Elias caught her. They're showing us pieces, he said. Not of what's to come, but of what we've forgotten. What we buried. He turned his gaze upward. The fog had risen again, circling them like wolves. From somewhere beyond the ruin came a sound, soft at first, barely audible above the hush of wind and grass. A tapping. Rhythmic. Like the ticking of an ancient clock. It echoed across the stone like a metronome for ghosts. And then, a voice. Not from a throat. Not even from the air. It came from the well itself, as though the stone remembered the words and now replayed them like a record. They wake at the edge of hunger. They watch behind the veil. The ground trembled. A pale root burst from the earth near Anora's boot, curling toward her like a blind worm seeking warmth. She leapt back. More appeared, thick and veined, exhaling faint plumes of green vapor. They spread outward from the base of the well, dragging with them fragments of cloth, bone, and metal buttons, the remnants of someone long lost. Elias's lantern surged brighter. The fog parted momentarily, just long enough for Anora to see what stood beyond the trees. A line of figures. Still, cloaked, faces hidden beneath veils of moss and thyme. Each held a lantern in one hand and something darker in the other, unshaped shadows shifting with every flicker of light. "They're the Watchers," Elias whispered. "They mark who crosses. They do not speak, only remember." One of the Watchers moved forward, its lantern dimming as it approached. Anora felt her chest tighten. It stopped less than 10 feet from her. Behind the veil, its face was hers, as it had appeared in the well. Frantic, hollowed. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. The figure raised its free hand, palm outstretched, and slowly pressed it to her chest. The world collapsed inward. She fell through memory, not her own, not entirely. A patchwork of lives and voices. A child singing a lullaby in a forgotten dialect. A woman burying a candle wrapped in birch bark. A man carving runes into a lantern handle before walking into the sea. Each image lasted only a moment, yet left her stained like old ink on parchment. When she woke, the sun had not risen, but the light had changed. Gray, sickly. The Watchers were gone. So was Elias. She was alone, standing beside the well. The wind whispered through the pines in tones that resembled speech, vowels stretched like breath, consonants lost to the branches. Then, a sound. Soft. Familiar. She turned. Elias stood at the tree line, half obscured by fog. His lantern was dark, his face unreadable. He lifted one hand, not in greeting, but in farewell, and turned away, disappearing into the trees without a word. Anora did not follow. She sat at the edge of the well and waited, her eyes fixed on the place where her reflection had once been. The ground beneath her pulsed. The breath of the earth was slower now, but it was still breathing, and the Watchers had marked her. The light that came after the Watchers' retreat was not sunlight. It had no warmth, no true direction. It filtered through the clouds in a pallid shimmer as though the sky had forgotten how to dawn. The trees around the hollow stood motionless, branches limp, bark oozing with dew that clung like oil. The scent of soil was sharp, metallic, as if iron veins pulsed beneath the earth's skin. Anora did not sleep. She only sat at the edge of the well and listened. The wind whispered, but not in words. It was a hush with rhythm, like breath passing over broken glass. Sometimes it almost sounded like her name. Other times it was a child's laughter, warped and distant as if carried from beneath a lake. She remembered the voice from the well, the one that said they watched behind the veil, and wondered if it had truly spoken aloud or only inside her thoughts. The silence that followed Elias's departure was not loneliness. It was expectation. And slowly, as the hush deepened and the world stilled, Anora began to feel as though she was no longer being followed, but waited for. The orchard, she discovered, had changed. It was no longer the orchard she and Elias had entered. This place was older, larger. The rows of trees were uneven, some towering like cathedral pillars, others bent low with age, gnarled like knuckles. Every branch bore no fruit, but instead hung with small, cracked lanterns, some made of paper, others of dried reed or bone. They did not glow. Not yet. She walked without knowing where she meant to go, her fingers brushing against the lanterns as she passed. Each one felt slightly warm to the touch, though no fire burned within. Some whispered as she touched them, faint and quick like breath drawn too fast to speak. Time bent strangely in the orchard. She could not tell if it was morning or dusk. Her shadow stretched in all directions, folding and reforming with each step. And always, beneath the rustle of leaves and the hush of wind, she heard the ticking, that same metronome-like rhythm from the well. It now seemed to come from the trees themselves, from inside the wood. She followed the sound. It led her to a clearing where the trees formed a natural ring, their branches woven together above like a ceiling of knotted roots. At the center stood a tall, narrow structure, a bell tower without a church. The wood was bleached, the iron fittings rusted and streaked with verdigris. A single bell hung suspended from the top, unmoving. She had seen this place before, not in life, in dream. She remembered standing in this very spot, barefoot, her hands bound with vine. The bell above had swung, though no rope pulled it, and the sound that emerged was not a bell's peal, but a long, low moan, the sound of grief pulled from the mouth of the world. As she stepped into the ring of trees, the ticking ceased. The wind died. The orchard held its breath, and the bell moved. No hand touched it. No rope hung from its mouth, but it swayed gently as if stirred by an invisible tide. Then it tolled once. The sound was deeper than before, not just in tone, but in depth. It seemed to rise from beneath the soil, through her bones, up her spine. The air shimmered, and suddenly she was no longer alone. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing. They were not the watchers. These were something else. They were dressed in burial robes, long, tattered, moth-eaten, and their skin was gray with the texture of parchment. Their faces were wrapped in cloth, but their eyes shone through, pale green like mold under glass. They watched her with a strange reverence, as though recognizing something that had been long prophesied. One stepped forward. It held a lantern, not lit. It held it out to her. Honora did not move, but her body did. Her hands, without command, reached for the lantern. Her fingers curled around it. The cloth-wrapped figure nodded once, then stepped back into the line. As soon as it did, the bell tolled again, and the lantern burst into light. Not fire, but memory. Images flared within it. A cabin buried beneath snow. A mother's voice. A storm of crows. A mirror that reflected not her face, but the orchard at dusk. Then the light faded and the lantern returned to stillness. The figures spoke then, all at once. Not in words, but in feelings. In sensations. Regret. Warning. Offering. She understood, somehow. The orchard had always been a threshold. Not a place of burial, but of transference. The veil between lives was thinnest here, not because it had worn away, but because it was tended, cultivated, kept supple through ritual, memory, silence. They were the tenders, the orchard's keepers. They had once been like her. Travelers, searchers, marked. Each of them had stood at the edge of forgetting and chosen to remember. And for that they had been transformed. Not dead, not alive, perennial. The bell tolled a third time, and the figures vanished. The trees resumed their whisper. The light shifted again, and the path before her was no longer soil but water. A stream now wound through the orchard, clear and glassy. Beneath its surface were hundreds of floating lanterns, slowly drifting. Their lights pulsed in rhythm, and Honora felt her own heartbeat begin to match them. She followed the stream. It wound past trees with bark like stitched skin, past shrines made of teeth and twine, past circles of stones where the fog never entered. And always, beneath everything, was the sound of breath, not hers, not wind, but the orchard's. Steady, eternal. Eventually, the stream emptied into a lake. A perfectly round body of water bordered by lantern posts and old wooden docks. The sky above it was not the same sky she had known. It was starless, yet bright, lit from beneath, perhaps. The lake's surface reflected nothing, and on the dock sat a man. He was old, or perhaps just weathered. His skin had the sheen of bark and his hair was moss. He wore robes stitched from faded fabric, each panel bearing a different symbol, runes she half recognized from the well. He looked up as she approached. "You've brought it," he said, nodding to the lantern in her hands. Honora opened her mouth to speak, but found she no longer needed to. Their thoughts met somewhere between words and air. He was the lantern keeper, the final threshold, the one who ensured that memory did not rot, that the souls marked for return or rest found their way. He rose slowly. "Your lantern is still dim," he said aloud this time, his voice like wind through reeds. "But it will brighten. If you choose to stay, stay." He nodded. "To tend, to guide, to remember. The orchard has chosen you, but the choice is still yours." She looked at the lake. Beneath its surface, she saw faces, not reflections. Echoes, people she had known but never met. Lives she had felt in dreams. Names she could almost recall. One of the faces smiled. A child. A version of herself untouched by time, grief, or forgetting. She looked down at her lantern. It flickered once, and she knew her answer. Honora stepped onto the dock, and it did not creak. Each board had been worn smooth by centuries of waiting, smoothed by feet that had passed this way and vanished. The lantern in her hands burned with a quiet pulse, not of fire, but of recollection. Each beat seemed to stir something in the lake, ripples moving across its surface as though in acknowledgement. The lantern keeper moved without sound. He walked to the lake's edge and extended one long, root-like finger toward the water. The surface peeled away, not disturbed but parted, like fabric drawn back by an unseen hand. Beneath, the lake was not water at all. It was memory, swirling, living, glowing. Honora saw glimpses of things that had no names. Places made of starlight and ash. A forest that remembered every footfall. A child's dream repeating across decades. A ship of bones adrift in a skyless sea. And within it all, her own face, younger, older, endless. She had been here before. Not in body, but in dream. In silence. The lantern keeper gestured to a low bench beside the dock, carved from the twisted remains of an ancient tree. She sat, her lantern resting on her lap. He did not speak again for a long while, and neither did she. Silence became their language. Finally, he turned to her. "Do you remember who you were before the orchard?" Honora nodded. "I do. And does that name still belong to you?" She paused. The wind moved slowly across the lake, lifting small flecks of light from its surface. Fireflies of thought. Dust of long-forgotten things. "No," she said at last. "I think I've outgrown it." The lantern keeper smiled. "Then you are ready." He knelt before the lake and pressed both hands to its surface. The parting widened, and a stairway emerged. Each step was made of stone wrapped in moss. The water did not fall or flow around it. It simply moved aside, respectful, as if it recognized something older than itself. The steps led downward into the lake, into the memory beneath. The orchard, he told her, was the threshold. The lake was the gate. And below the lake, beneath all things, was the archive, where memories were kept, where the echoes of every forgotten soul were gathered, sifted, and lit. The stair welcomed her. It did not feel wet. It did not chill her skin. As she descended, the air grew softer, heavier, not with weight, but with intention. Every step was a choice, a letting go. Down she went, past the shimmer of the water skin, past the rippling lantern lights, down into stillness. And then the archive opened before her. It was not a hall, not a chamber. It was a world. Vaults of sky stretched above her, where clouds were made of parchment and stars blinked like candle flames behind stained glass. Shelves rose from the misty floor, vast and spiraling, filled not with books but vessels. Jars, urns, orbs, and satchels, each one humming with quiet memory. Figures moved through the archive, tenders like the ones she'd seen before, but older, dimmer. They moved with reverence, each tending a particular vessel, dusting, singing, weeping. Some knelt in circles and whispered into the jars. Others walked slowly, dragging tools made of bone and smoke behind them. She wandered, lantern in hand, and as she walked, vessels began to glow. Each one she passed flared with gentle light. Some pulsed, some flickered almost shyly, and she realized they knew her. They recognized something in her, a trace, a resonance. They had known her voice in another life. She stopped at one shelf where a silver urn pulsed with sharp green fire. Without touching it, she heard it. A hill, a single door, hands wrapped in linen, a promise broken on winter's breath. She left, and he waited not for her, but for her shadow. The memory was not hers, but it knew her, and she knew what to do. She raised her lantern. The light passed from her into the urn, and it sighed, not with relief, but with rest. A nearby tender looked up and nodded. "You've begun," it said, its voice dry as leaves. She moved deeper into the archive, and she began to listen. Each vessel told a story, not in language, but in sensation. Pain as a map, joy as a rhythm, grief as architecture. She did not need to understand, she needed only to carry. Her lantern grew warmer with each memory shared, each echo gathered. She came to understand that the orchard was not only a boundary, it was a bridge, and the archive beneath the lake was its foundation. Here, the dead were not lost. They were not even truly dead. They were held, kept in stillness until they could be remembered fully, until they could walk again in dream, in whisper, in silence. Some would rise through lantern light, others would pass through wind, and some, if they were truly ready, would become tenders themselves. She passed a mirror carved from obsidian. It showed no reflection, only her lantern, now filled with dozens of pulsing lights, each a fragment of memory reclaimed. The lantern keeper appeared behind her. "You carry them well," he said. She turned. "How long have I been here?" He looked at the shelves around them. "Time does not flow here. It accumulates, like dust or ash. You've been here as long as you need to be." She thought of Elias, of the path that had brought them to the orchard, of the voices in the well. "What happens when the lantern is full?" she asked. The keeper tilted his head. "Then you must choose, to carry it beyond, to plant it as a seed, or to return and gather more." She looked at her lantern. It was warm now, heavy, full of silence, not emptiness, but presence. "I think I'd like to see what grows," she said. The keeper bowed, and the archive began to fade. The shelves pulled away like mist. The urn sank back into soil. The sky above flickered, then blinked shut. The stair behind her lit with soft green glow. And she rose. Step by step, memory behind her, she climbed back toward the lake's surface, but she did not break through into water. Instead, she emerged in a field, moonlit, endless. The orchard was gone, but the lantern still burned in her hand. And behind her, unseen, the archive whispered its approval. The frost had crept inward. It wasn't merely on the glass anymore, nor just in the silent woods. It was in the breath of the villagers, in the stillness of their limbs, in the very marrow of the days. Time thickened like syrup, molasses poured too slowly, and each hour staggered forward reluctantly, dragging shadows behind it. Nora felt it in her bones now, that hush that wasn't peace, but a vacuum where things once were. At night, the silence had begun to hum. Not with sound precisely, but with weight, like something watching, listening, exhaling slowly. The quiet between the wind gusts was no longer empty. It had substance, direction, and within it she had started to dream again. But these were not her own dreams. In them she stood in other bodies, a child with cinder-streaked hair staring at the well, an old man weeping by the lantern tree, a woman, faceless, kneeling in snow that turned red beneath her. The dreams were stitched with whispers, hushed prayers in languages Nora didn't recognize but somehow understood. They weren't begging to be saved. They were asking to be remembered. The chapel bell rang again, though no one pulled the rope. This time she was awake to hear it, a low, brassy chime that made the leaves on the altar trees shudder. The villagers gathered slowly in the dusk, eyes glassy, heads bowed, like they were walking to confession in a language not meant for forgiveness. She followed. Inside the chapel, the wood was darker, the carvings more intricate. New growths of moss had bloomed in the carvings, like veins crawling across a forgotten body. The lanterns inside gave off a pale green light, and the priest, if he could still be called that, stood behind the altar with a smile that belonged more to bone than to flesh. He spoke no words, only raised his hand, and the villagers began to hum. Low and even, the note vibrated the air. Nora felt her heartbeat slow. The note unlocked something in the corners of her memory. Her grandmother had hummed that tone when she laid bundles of rosemary and salt in the windows. Her father had murmured it in the cellar, drunk and trembling, during the worst of the storms. She'd heard it once before when the fog came too fast and her brother vanished into it, never to return. It was not a hymn. It was a binding. She stepped back, and the floor groaned beneath her, not with wood, but with a voice. A voice from beneath. The ground remembers. She fled. Out into the black orchard, trees twisting like hands mid-gesture, lanterns bobbing slowly as if tied to breaths. The fog was thicker now, dampening every thought, every fear. It whispered with movement, not wind, not animal, but something else. In the heart of the orchard stood a circle of stones, older than the village, older than the forest. She did not remember walking to it, but her feet were bare and bloody from roots she hadn't felt. In the center was a mirror of still water, no wider than a well. She looked in. What looked back was not her face. It was her shadow, staring up, smiling a smile made of silence. Behind her, a voice like cracked ice whispered, "What you bury feeds the roots." By the time the last leaves had turned brittle and brown, drifting down from the skeletal canopy above, Ellis had come to know the rhythm of the gloaming veil intimately. He no longer moved as an intruder within its haunted boundaries, but rather as one slowly becoming part of the land's dreaming silence. He understood now how the fog curled low over the roots of trees as though seeking lost memories, how the wind whispered down the stone-lined ravines with voices too old to belong to the living. Each morning, the lanterns that floated on the perimeter of the fields seemed dimmer, as if their source of will was fading. Ellis took this as a sign. The cycle was reaching its culmination. The hollow stone called to him. He had seen it in dreams, a monolith of weathered granite, split down the middle and hollowed from within, seated deep in a hollow behind the orchard. It did not appear on any maps, nor did the villagers speak of it, though their silence was perhaps the loudest acknowledgement. When Ellis asked about the stone, Mrs. Carroll merely tightened her lips and began humming an old hymn. Father Belden, once firm in his doctrine, simply crossed himself and looked away. It was only the lanterns that led him. On the 7th night since the dream began repeating, Ellis followed them without hesitation. They flickered like fireflies, weaving a crooked line through the orchard and across the northern moors, past the old windmill and into the briar-choked hollow beyond. The hollow stone was just as the dreams had shown. It rose from the earth like a shard of bone, taller than any man, cracked down its center and weeping with black moss. Around it, the air was thinner, charged with a static hum that made the fine hairs on his arms rise. The sky above held no stars, only a rolling quilt of cloud and distant lightning, silent and purple-veined. There were markings inside the cleft, not carved but grown, as if the stone had absorbed the symbols over centuries. Spirals, branching lines, and concentric circles echoing the very patterns Ellis had seen drawn on the inside of the cabin's attic. His lantern flickered once, twice, and then extinguished, leaving only the silver glow radiating faintly from the markings. He stepped inside. The world narrowed. Inside the hollow stone, time collapsed into breath. The sound of wind ceased. There was no heartbeat, no footfall, only the rustle of unseen wings and the faint scent of earth and something older, a scent like forgotten incense or burned offerings. In that stillness, Ellis felt memory rise. Not his own. Memories of the land, of those who had come before. He saw them in flashes, a woman in white kneeling by the stone, placing a bowl of ash and water at its base, a child pressing his palm into the mossy wall and whispering a name now lost, a procession of faceless figures beneath lanterns that did not burn with flame. And he heard the name of the place as it had once been known. Cairnveril. It was not just a boundary between worlds, but a conduit, a breathing gate. When Ellis emerged, the orchard had changed. The fog had thinned to a translucent veil, revealing far more than the eye should see. Beneath the trees, skeletal figures rested in the soil, curled as though sleeping. Their empty eye sockets stared not upward, but toward the stone. And at the edge of the orchard, waiting patiently, stood the figure from his earliest dreams, a woman in a lantern-lit cloak, her eyes deep as wells and her hands holding a bowl carved from ashwood. "You are the last," she said softly. Ellis understood. He knelt before her, hands trembling but willing. She placed the bowl in his palms, and the moment he touched it, the wind returned, rushing through the veil like the first breath after drowning. The lanterns flared once more to life, not with fire, but with a steady, green luminescence. It was not death that the gloaming veil held so dear. It was memory. It was passage. It was promise. And Ellis had become its steward. The storm that had lingered for days broke with the dawn. Pale shafts of light spilled through the thinning clouds, weak and uncertain, as if even the sun hesitated to pierce the veil that blanketed the land. Ellis awoke to the sound of soft rain pattering on the wooden sill, and for a moment the world felt suspended, quiet, as though it too was listening. The dreams had changed. No longer plagued by formless whispers or distant cries, he now stood in fields of amber grass beneath silver skies, surrounded by the silhouettes of those long past. They spoke not in words, but in presence, a chorus of memory, emotion, and yearning that resonated deep within him. He awoke not with fear, but with the echo of longing. He sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his hands together to summon warmth into his stiff fingers. His eyes turned instinctively to the window where the orchard loomed in soft grays, each gnarled tree shivering in the breeze. There, near the old path, he saw her again, the girl in the moss-colored dress, standing barefoot in the mud. Her face was turned toward the house, but her eyes were cast to something distant, beyond the field and beyond the waking world. Ellis rose slowly, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside, letting the chill wrap around him. The air was rich with the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves. He didn't call to her this time. He simply followed. The girl led him beyond the orchard, past the broken stone wall that once marked the edge of the Briar Wall estate. The trees grew denser here, their branches knotted like arthritic fingers, and the mist clung low to the ground, coiling around his boots. She moved ahead with unnatural grace, as though her feet did not touch the soil. When he quickened his pace, she slowed. When he hesitated, she waited. At the base of a low hill, she stopped. Beneath a weeping willow, its trunk hollowed and blackened by time, stood an old iron gate nearly swallowed by roots and ivy. He had never seen this place before, not in his waking life, nor in any dream. Yet it felt known, as if it had been waiting. The girl turned to him, her eyes glowing with a faint, unearthly green. She placed a single finger to her lips, then stepped through the gate and vanished into the willow's shadow. Ellis hesitated, his breath caught in his throat. Then, with the hush of the rain around him and the silence of the forest urging him onward, he stepped through. The air changed immediately, colder, heavier. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost spongy, as though it had not been walked upon in generations. A narrow trail wound through the underbrush, lined with stones etched in ancient glyphs. Here and there, bones jutted from the soil, pale and delicate like roots bleached by moonlight. As he moved deeper, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Lanterns, unlit, hung from twisted poles. Statues of robed figures, their faces eroded by time, watched in eternal stillness. He could feel something stirring beneath the ground, a slow, rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of the earth. And then he saw it, the shrine. Half buried in the hill, its arched doorway framed by ivy and thorn, it rose like a wound in the land. A symbol was carved above the entrance, the same spiral he had seen in his dreams, the same shape etched into the locket he found in the attic. He stepped inside. The air within was thick with incense and shadow. Flickering green flames danced along the walls, casting ghostly shapes that moved even when he stood still. The chamber was circular, its floor inlaid with concentric rings of obsidian and bone. At its center stood a pedestal upon which rested a bowl filled with dark water. As Ellis approached, the surface of the water shimmered. Images swirled, a child's laughter echoing in an empty hall, a lantern swinging in the mist, hands reaching from beneath the soil. He saw the girl, her face serene, her eyes ancient. She beckoned him forward. He touched the water. A wave of cold surged through him, pulling him into memory, into vision. He saw Briarwall as it had once been, full of life, of sorrow, of secrets. He saw the rituals performed to keep the veil intact, to silence the whispers from beneath. He saw the cost, and he saw the moment it failed. The last guardian had been betrayed not by malice, but by fear. The gate had opened just a crack, and through it had poured the silence that devours. Ellis staggered back, breathless. The girl was beside him now. She did not speak, but he felt her thoughts as if they were his own. She was the last echo of the guardian line, a remnant, a whisper, a watchful soul bound to the land. And now she had chosen him. The torch must be passed. The silence must be tended. He knelt before the pedestal, feeling the weight of centuries settle on his shoulders. In that moment, he understood this was not a curse, but a calling. Outside, the wind shifted. The orchard sighed, and Briarwall, ancient and waiting, exhaled in relief. The snow fell softly now, not in torrents or flurries, but in slow, lazy spirals, each flake drifting with dreamlike indifference from the low gray sky above Thornmere. The old orchard lay still, blanketed in silver dust. Its trees, once twisted and clutching, stood hushed and humbled, their bark cracked and dark beneath the frost. The bones of the land, the buried stones, the sunken fence posts, the crooked gates, all lay hidden now beneath a quieting veil. On the edge of the stillborn forest, where the fog no longer clung quite so tight to the air, stood Elsbeth. Her breath rose in faint clouds. In her hand, she held the lantern. Not the physical one she'd carried through root-choked passages and rain-slick halls, but the one she'd always carried within, the light of knowing. The quiet flame of acceptance. The last of the house had fallen days before, not in collapse, but in fading. Room by room, it had peeled itself away from the waking world, until only a shell remained. The library had gone first, its books whispering their own pages closed. Then the halls, their paintings sighing into silence. Even the great staircase had shuddered and slumped, each step sinking into nothing like old breath. Only the solarium had stayed, and only long enough to say goodbye. There, among the wilting orchids and cracked panes, Elsbeth had seen the last faces. They'd come as they always had, not to frighten, not to torment, but to linger, to mourn. The lost daughters of Thornmere, the hollow-eyed guests of Briarwall, the man in the mirror who'd never aged. They had watched her, not with malice, but with sorrow, with longing, and then, one by one, they'd stepped into the mist, dissolving like candle smoke. She had not wept, not then. Only now, as she turned back one final time, did the tears come. Thornmere was no longer a place but a memory, one that had finally, gracefully, forgotten itself. She walked along the orchard's edge until the fog grew lighter, until the bitter tang of the marsh gave way to the soft scent of pine and earth. Somewhere ahead, the narrow road would emerge. Somewhere ahead, morning might come. But before she left the threshold of the fading realm, she paused. She set the lantern gently upon a stone, now half covered in frost, and into its glow she whispered, "Sleep well." And in the stillness that followed, the wind answered, not with a howl or a moan, but with a hush, a lullaby hummed by a world too old for speech. The vale was whole again, and behind it the dead dreamed on. Epilogue: a wind among the trees. No one spoke of Thornmere anymore. The maps no longer marked its woods, and the old road that once led there had long since vanished beneath moss and mud. Only in rare moments, on still nights when the fog lay thick and the stars seemed hesitant, would its memory stir. Travelers spoke of dreams, of orchards where roots curled like fingers and lanterns drifted on unseen breezes, of a house without doors, and a library that smelled of lavender and dusk, of faces behind frost-covered glass, watching, waiting, but they always woke, and always the dreams faded, all but one. In a garden far from Briarwall, in a house filled with books and the scent of cedarwood, a woman waters her orchids. She moves slowly now. Her hands are older, but her eyes are clear, and sometimes, at dusk, she lights a lantern and smiles.